I just started this session.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, I think you could begin. The people are already joining in.
Okay. Good. Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to everyone for today's PSDRN, or Private Sector Development Research Networks seminar series, which will focus on the local integration of foreign firms. Today's seminar will be hosted by the International Growth Center, or IGC, which is a member organization at PSDRN. I'm Christian Lippert. I'm a country economist working with the IGC in Rwanda. So for those of you who are new to the seminar or probably attending it for the first time, PSDRN Research Network is a group of organizations, including development finance institutions, think tanks, and academic organizations, actively supporting research related to the private sector, and increasingly also looking at the nexus of climate change, sustainability, and private sector growth. You can follow the PSDRN seminar series for this year, and the details of which will be posted in the chat box. So the host organization of today is IGC, and we are a research organization headquartered at the LSE and working in close partnership with the University of Oxford. IGC functions through its country offices, and over 7 of our offices are located in South Asia and Africa. Some of our thematic areas of research include firms and international trade, energy and climate change, and cities and sustainable growth. I invite you to read more about IGC's work in our website. So let's come to today's event, and we are very excited and honored indeed to have with us Professor Isabella Manelic. Professor Manelic is an assistant professor of economics at the LSE. Her research focuses on international trade and development economics, and she published on a wide range of topics such as multinational supply chains, multinational firms, and industrial policy. And you can read more about Professor Manelic's research, and the details of which will be posted in the chat box as well. So we are excited to have here with us her and hear more about whether the local integration of foreign firms matters, and combining theory and evidence from a list of countries. So I will quickly review a few housekeeping rules before I pass on the floor to Professor Manelic. So all attendees have been muted for the seminar to minimize background noise. And if you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box. So if it's a bigger picture question, we will raise it at the end of the talk. If it's a clarifying question, then we will raise it during the talk. We are going to have a designated time at the end of the seminar to answer these questions. So please make sure you include your full name and organizational affiliation along with your question. We are recording today's session, and a video and audio recording will be made available on PSDRN's website. So you can go back and check them on the website later, or pass it on to your friends. I'd also like to point out that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation, so please take a minute to fill it out later on, as your feedback is very important to us. So without much further ado, I will now pass on to Professor Manelic. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation, and Christian for the presentation. Very kind of you. This is a team effort, as this slide reflects. This is joint work with Jose Vasquez, who's also an assistant professor here at the LSE, a long-term co-author, with Alonso Alfaro Reña, a research economist at the Central Bank of Costa Rica, Banu Demir, an associate professor at Oxford with great expertise on the Turkish economy, Cédric Dupré, a research economist at the National Bank of Belgium, and Priya Manwaring, who used to be a country economist for the IGC in Uganda and is currently a graduate student at Oxford, and who brings in her rich expertise on the Ugandan economy. So without further ado, now that we know this is not just me, but it takes a village, let me introduce today's talk. So what is the background? Why do we care about foreign firms and their behavior in the receiving economy? So first, we know that countries compete fiercely through productive public infrastructure, through tax breaks to attract superstar firms. And the kind of superstar firms that we're going to focus on explicitly today are those that have foreign direct investment, so that have some foreign ownership. And these are the firms of interest to us, both because they're the object of explicit policies, and also because in most developing countries, FDI firms are those that are the superstar firms of those economies. There are very few and in between domestic firms that would qualify as a superstar firm, however you want to define it in function of size and or exporting behavior, etc. So why are policymakers interested in attracting such firms? There's first a mechanical, a direct effect expected, namely that they would create direct employment and boost the productivity, the total factor productivity in the industry that they join. But there are also important indirect effects that they're expected. If we are in an economy with a considerable share of idle resources, let's say unemployment, sometimes even just the expected economic activity that is expected to be engendered by the presence of these FDI firms might already be valuable enough if there are such idle resources. But even if there are not idle resources, or even if we have to abstract away from this feature prevalent in developing countries, we might have other types of distortions in which, given which, it might be welfare enhancing to reallocate resources towards interactions with these FDI firms. So to be explicit, to the extent that at least some of the FDI firms have the potential to generate net production externalities through knowledge spillovers, let's say in their supply chain, then we're not indifferent as to how integrated these foreign firms are in the local supply chains. And the emphasis in this paper will be more on the indirect effects that are, and you might ask yourself why. And to those of you familiar with this literature, you might realize that in the type of cost-benefit analysis that are done by policymakers when they decide how generous their attraction packages should be, these indirect benefits are actually a big part, if not the biggest, of the overall expected benefits. So we really think it's valuable to understand whether those indirect benefits are materialized or not. Moreover, the main channel of local integration of these FDI firms, both in the mind of policymakers, but also in the emphasis of academics, has been that through supply chain linkages. So the words local integration might have been too vague. What we're going to explicitly look into is what are the sourcing behaviors of these FDI firms in the local economy? How do they integrate into the domestic supply chain of those countries? And there is also evidence from work that Alonso and Jose have and myself have done, but also there is a longer literature on spillovers from supplying to multinationals. And what we know is that these supply chain linkages have the potential to generate TFP gains above and beyond just a mere demand effect. And moreover, not only that these productivity gains exist, but it's important to acknowledge that not all FDI firms are created equal. And in our work in the context of Costa Rica, we showed that actually in industries such as agriculture or low-tech manufacturing, we don't find these productivity gains experienced by domestic suppliers. So we're not just interested in how integrated these foreign firms are into the local economy, but we also are curious about which are the firms that are more or less integrated, acknowledging that not all of them might trigger not only the demand effect, but also the productivity gain on top. And as a last point of motivation, there's surprisingly little evidence on how integrated superstar FDI firms really are, and what drives their patterns of integration. What are those factors that matter as to how integrated foreign firms are? Is it about the industry that they operate in and how technologically sophisticated that industry is? Is it about organizational constraints that make multinationals want to source from global established suppliers? What are those factors that explain those patterns of integration? And there's surprisingly little evidence relative to how many resources are dedicated to attracting these firms who are expected to link with these domestic firms, and also resources going towards setting up linkages programs. And depending on which is the institution that sets them up, they can be called supplier development programs, matchmaking programs, etc. So what is the aim of this paper? So first, we want to establish a set of stylized facts about the supply chain integration of FDI firms into the domestic production network of 4 very different countries. And namely, we're going to look one by one at the case of Uganda, Costa Rica, Turkey, and Belgium. So as you can see, countries are very different among each other in terms of the all sorts of development, economic development indicators. And we're going to ask a series of descriptive questions, such as how integrated are FDI firms into the local supply chain of every country? How does that compare to what we used to know via input-output tables? And also, in which ways do these FDI firms in each of these 4 countries source differently from domestic firms? And we're interested to see if there are commonalities across these countries, or if there are specificities that could be driven by the type of multinationals that are attracted to each country, or characteristics of each of these receiving economies. And in the second part of the project, which I will emphasize less today, we take a more normative approach, and we ask ourselves, how do these patterns of integration affect the welfare effects of FDI? And what are the kind of integration patterns that policymakers should encourage, given the ways in which the gains from FDI propagate along these linkages? There's a rich literature. I'm told I don't have a lot of time to go through everything, so I'll just say there's a long tradition in development economics that cares about attracting or favoring sectors and firms with strong linkages. There's a long literature thinking about the effects of FDI firms with a big emphasis on suppliers' productivity. There's a smaller literature thinking about the effects of superstar firms. And also there's another literature that we relate to, which emphasizes the importance of using actual firm level data on sourcing behaviors, as opposed to relying on input-output tables that have all sorts of issues when it comes to proxying for the behavior of special firms of interest. So without further ado, let me first describe very briefly the data and providing some basic summary statistics. At a high level, we're putting together firm level panel data from 4 different countries. We're not linking the data sets across these countries, just to be clear. These are 4 different sets of data sets that are not linked across each other. So from Uganda, Costa Rica, Turkey, and Belgium. The jewel of the crown, the most important data set for each of these 4 countries, is the VAT-based data set that allows us to track all the firm-to-firm transactions between firms located in each of these 4 economies. So we know not only who interacts with whom, which firm interacts with which firm as a buyer and seller in each of these economies, but we also observe the intensive margin. So we observe what values they transact with each other. Of course, we want overall measures of firm size, total sales, employment, wage bill. We want to know how much firms import and export. So we also have these incorporated these types of data. We also need to know which are the foreign firms, which are the superstar firms, and we have data from all of these 4 countries on the identity of the foreign-owned firms. And last, we also care about understanding sectoral differences and spatial differences in behavior. So we also need to know what is the sectoral affiliation and the location of each firm in each of these 4 economies. Very quickly, just to fix ideas on the sample, by construction, we only study the formal economy in these 4 countries. And this is an important mention to make, particularly in an economy such as the Ugandan one, where informality is very prevalent. It is a concern as to the extent to which we're capturing the wider economy, particularly in Uganda. But if you think about the object of interest, which is the supply chain of foreign firms, we think that this particular shortcoming is not as binding, because it's unlikely that FDI firms, that multinationals would have in their supply chain small informal firms. We need firms to appear in each of these data sets. We need to observe them in the balance sheet data, in the firm-to-firm transaction data, and we need to observe them with employment. So this shrinks a bit the initial sample. Because of which sectors are captured in the data set of the 4 countries, and to have comparability across them, we are not going to include the mining and quarrying and financial activities sector. We're also dropping public firms that have a public scope. And last, which is an important caveat to mention, is that the reporting threshold that makes a firm appear in our sample depends across countries. So very quickly, as we go and show you some summary statistics about these firms, you're going to realize that firms in Uganda will seem quite large relative and fewer than firms in, let's say, Belgium. But that's not because overall in the economy, firms in Uganda are bigger, but it's only because the reporting threshold to appear in the data is much lower in a country like Belgium than it is in a country like Uganda. So very quickly, very notable differences across these economies, going from the GDP per capita, which is 25 times PPP in Belgium relative to Uganda. As I said, the prevalence of the informal economy, 88% of employment in Uganda is informal relative to 11% in Belgium. How open to trade these countries are. On the one extreme, you have Belgium, where the trade openness index is 154%, and at the less integrated part of the spectrum, you have Uganda, for which this value is 38%. And of course, the kind of goods that each economy has a comparative advantage in and are exported are very different between the coffee, tea, and spices that are exported in Uganda versus the pharmaceuticals that are exported in Belgium. Now, going to describing the firms, we observe, so the way this is organized is each country has one table. The Uganda, so the caption is under the table. So the first table is for Uganda, then for Costa Rica, Turkey, and Belgium. And here we're showing just the average of each variable in the columns, split between firms and FDI firms and domestic firms. And what we can observe is that in general, domestic firms are a small share of the overall number of firms in each of these economies. However, each of these firms, they're very big. So they're an order of magnitude bigger, irrespective of which variable you want to focus on, if it's workers, wage bill, CAT sales, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of—
Isabella?
Yes, please.
There's a question from
Yes.
Roy Tico he's a
Mhm.
research fellow at the European University Institute in Italy. And he asked, how do you identify the FDI investment?
Yes, so in each of these countries, there is a tracking of which firms receive foreign capital, receive foreign investment. And we are tagging as being an FDI firm any firm that has more than 10% of its capital being foreign owned. In the majority of cases, most of these investments are greenfield investments, so they're fully foreign owned. But there are also firms that are only partially foreign owned. Thank you. Now, in terms of the importance in the economy of each of the foreign firms, what we observe here is that even if foreign firms are a small share of the number of firms in each economy, so under 5–6% depending on the country, when you look at of the share of the economy that they directly impact through their own sheer size, we see that across the four economies, the share of employment, of sales, of exports and imports is disproportionately going towards FDI firms relative to the number of firms that they represent in the economy. Now, in terms of getting an idea of what are the kind of firms that appear, foreign firms in each of these countries, we could have rank them by employment or by importance in exports or importance in sales, and of course the ranking would slightly change. We chose to use their importance as a percentage of the total employment of all FDI firms in a given country. And what we see is that in the case of Costa Rica, Turkey, and Belgium, the most important industries in which FDI is present is the manufacturing industry. So 34%, 42%, and 37% of FDI employment. Whereas in Uganda, FDI is less concentrated in manufacturing. It's only 18%, and more concentrated in the administrative and support services industry. So for instance, a lot of the security guards are hired in firms that are foreign owned. Now moving into the stylized facts on the local integration of FDI firms. I think that the biggest question that a descriptive or a positive exploration of this question needs to face, and the reason why we do need a model and to think it through is that it's not clear what is the right measure of local integration of FDI firms. So even if someone goes with the most comprehensive data set available out there and says, I really want to measure with extreme precision how integrated foreign firms are, it's unclear from a welfare perspective, from an aggregate perspective, without having a view of the world as to why do we care about the integration of these foreign firms. It's hard to know what is the right measure. So what we do in this part of the project is to say, well, depending on what is your worldview as to why it matters whether foreign firms are integrated or not, and in which ways, there's this entire menu of ways in which you could look at their integration, and the conclusions that you would draw would be very different depending on how you would measure this integration. And that's why the last part of the project, the one in which we want to bring light on the right measure from a normative perspective, is so necessary. So there are constraints as to the measurement of how should we measure this integration, but there's also the bigger question of what is the right measure to use, which is the measure that is welfare relevant, okay? So we need assumptions in order to know what this right measure is, on whether the economy is operating at full capacity or not, at whether there is a sourcing pattern heterogeneity across FDI firms or not. Do we care about how this integration behaves across industries? Do we think there are production externalities from being in the supply chain of an FDI firm? And to the extent that we think there are production externalities from supplying to certain FDI firms, we need to know how do these externalities propagate. Do they propagate upon a magic touch? You just interact once with a buyer with externalities and you get the magic touch TFP gain. Is it proportional to the sales? Is it proportional to the share of sales that you make to these firms, or is it proportional to the duration of the linkage? So without having a model that helps us clarify these things, reasonable contenders are how much foreign firms purchase from domestic suppliers and what is the total indirect employment that they generate for them. What are the, how does that compare with what we thought we knew from the input-output table? Maybe we think we care about the total number of firms that these firms interact with, and thinking that we're in this world in which we have a magic touch and interacting even $1 with an FDI firm is going to give you this lump sum gain. Or maybe what we care about is not only the number of firms that interact with them, but also the intensity of this interaction measured by the share of sales that goes towards these firms. And last, there's an additional consideration. Do we really care about the FDI status of these firms? Do we really think there's something special about the fact that these firms have foreign ownership? Maybe at the end of the day, foreign firms are just large firms. And there might be policies that encourage firm growth from within the country to turn domestic firms into superstar firms. So maybe what we care about is the behavior of firms once we acknowledge that FDI firms are first and foremost large firms, and we would want to maybe compute job multipliers that account for the size of these domestic firms. So you divide the total number of indirect jobs that they generate over the direct jobs at these firms, or maybe we want to explicitly control in a regression for firm size. So I know I will run short out of time, so I will just focus on some of the columns in these tables. So in the first world in which we think we really just care about how these firms purchase from the local economy, we think that maybe there is slack capacity, that maybe these purchases would not have happened absent these firms in the economy. Then we would just want to look at how much they buy from the local economy and how many firms they're interacting with. And on that dimension, in that way of measuring the local integration, of course, FDI firms are huge firms, and therefore they're big spenders in each of these economies. So irrespective of what country you look at and irrespective of its level of development, you see that FDI firms purchase significantly more locally and do so from significantly more suppliers. Now let's ask ourselves, okay, we know these are big spenders, but let's go more into the details of understanding how much they're actually integrating, how much they're actually interacting with domestic firms. So what we have in this table, and I'm only going to focus on the first three columns, are raw summary statistics. So this is not a regression, these are just averages. And I will run a regression. We will run a regression in the next slide. But for now, let's just look at the raw means of three particular variables. The first one is the value added share. So it's how much of the total sales of firms, how much of that value is created in-house, as opposed to coming from intermediate inputs purchased from outside of the boundaries of the firm. And what we find in this case is that between in Uganda, between FDI firms and domestic firms, we don't find a big difference. However, in Costa Rica, we find that a much bigger share of the value that these firms create is actually created in-house. We don't yet have the results from Turkey and Belgium, but our intuition is that they will resemble more the Costa Rican case than they will resemble the Ugandan case. Then in the second column, we're asking ourselves what share of the total inputs that are purchased by these firms are purchased locally as opposed to being imported. So locally within the boundaries of that country. And what we see is that there's a big discrepancies, both in the case of Uganda and in the case of Costa Rica, such that foreign firms, they buy a much lower share of their total inputs locally relative to domestic firms. So we have 50% in the case of Uganda and 65% in the case of Costa Rica for foreign firms, whereas domestic firms, they buy 74% of their inputs value locally versus 90% in Costa Rica.
Isabella?
Yes.
There's another question from Shubranka from the IGC. She asks, how does the study identify superstar firms? That is, what are some of the characteristics?
Yeah, so in this case, the label of superstar is just FDI. So it's, do you have more than 10% of your capital coming from a different country than your own country, so foreign capital. And as I mentioned to a similar question that I received before, in the vast majority of cases, these FDI investments are greenfield, meaning that the entire firm is foreign owned. But of course, there's also some brownfield investments. So we also have firms that have mixed ownership. We also have the whole series of results. We also have them for superstar firms defined as the top 1% of sales or top 1% of employment across all firms in the economy. And actually, the behavior is very similar. But it's similar because most superstar firms are actually foreign firms. But we thought that it's clearer to define superstar firms as foreign firms because, again, they're the explicit object of interest of policymakers, and it's just there's like an objective way to define their foreign ownership. Okay.
Isabella, I
Yes.
have one more question
Yes,
from Filippo Santi, also from the European University Institute. And so he wonders how do you explain the value added share to be higher for FDI firms in Costa Rica, but lower in Uganda? And how much does the sectoral composition in the two countries affect this difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this table, we are not controlling for the industry of firms, and we just wanted to have a sense of what the means are. And as we wrote in the lower part of the slide, we say, well, it could be that FDI firms are more prevalent in industries that are less integrated, in industries that have particular characteristics relevant to the sourcing behavior. So maybe the difference is not in the FDI status of the firm, but it's really in the industries in which firms select into. And that's why in the next slide, we're actually going to control for the industry of the firm. But the purpose of this slide is to give you a sense of the magnitudes, because then when you go to the regressions, you don't acknowledge what the mean levels are. So for instance, in column 3, we learn that about a third of all inputs that firms buy within their economy is bought from other FDI firms. And we were not aware before we just looked at these raw means of how important foreign suppliers are also for both domestic firms and for FDI firms. They're particularly more important for FDI firms. So FDI firms tend to buy more from other FDI firms, but also domestic firms themselves are benefiting from the possibility of purchasing from FDI firms themselves. So maybe without further ado, let me go to the tables in which we actually run the regressions. And what do we have? So we have the same outcomes that we had in the previous slide. And there we run a regression at the firm level, and the firm being either a domestic firm or a foreign firm. And we look into its value added share, what share of its purchases are done locally. Out of those done locally, what share is coming from another foreign firm. And then we're also looking at how that's distributed in terms of the magnitudes of the transactions and also in terms of the number of suppliers that they purchase from. And here in this table, we're not controlling for firm size yet. So in the next slide, we're going to control for firm size. At this point, we're just characterizing differences between FDI firms and domestic firms. However, notice the fixed effects. So here, compared to the previous table that I've shown you, we are controlling for common trends that happen at the 4-digit industry and year level and also region year level. So these are comparisons between foreign firms and domestic firms within the same 4-digit industry and region. So here we're no longer capturing differences in what industries firms are selecting into. Okay, that was a concern with the previous evidence that we showed, that it might have been that part of these differences that we were seeing between foreign firms and domestic firms within and across countries were driven by the different industries in which firms select into. Okay, so what are the things that are the same in terms of sign and significance across countries, and what are the things that are varying on the context? So let's focus first on the things that are the same in terms of significance and patterns, the sign. So we observe that across the 4 countries, foreign firms are much less likely to be sourcing locally than to import, where the outside option is importing. So put differently, they're more likely to import. And the magnitude of that difference between foreign firms and domestic firms, again, within the same 4-digit industry and region, is between 10% and 20%, depending on the country. So that's column 2. In column 3, what we're learning is that if you compare an FDI firm versus a domestic firm within the same industry and region, we observe that foreign firms are significantly more likely to buy from other foreign firms themselves, as opposed to buying from domestic firms that they might have access to in that country. Then in columns 4 and 5, what we learn is that, to a big extent, this is going to be driven by their sheer size. They have bigger values of transactions and more suppliers relative to domestic firms in the same industry and region. The pattern that is not as consistent across countries is what is the value added share. So how much of the overall value of the CIT sales is done in-house. And in the case of Costa Rica and Belgium, we find a bigger share for the FDI firms, whereas in Uganda and Turkey, we don't find significant effects or even negative effects. So this might have to do with the kind of industry, with the kind of processes that these firms have, even within an industry, and how easy it is to find local or to find input providers that are outside of the boundaries of the firm. Now, in this table, what we do is we control for the firm size. And this is it's not an obvious decision of whether we want to control or not. So if you say, what I care about is to really understand how much of these differences in sourcing are driven by the foreign nature of the firm, and I really want to control for anything else that might be shared, might be common between domestic firms and foreign firms, then yes, you would want to control for the size of the buyer, of whether it's a foreign buyer or a domestic buyer. And this is what we do in this table. But if you think, well, one of the reasons why we want to attract foreign firms to begin with is that it's very hard to create from within domestic firms of comparable size. So the size of the foreign firm is one of its defining features. Then this exercise makes no sense, because then you would take away one of the core characteristics of multinationals. But with this big picture thought in mind, let me just tell you what controlling for firm size does. So what it does is that on the first column, now we see a very clear pattern that once you control for firm size, so you're shrinking even further the control group for foreign firms and domestic firms, we're seeing that foreign firms, after you've controlled for firm size, are creating more value in-house than they are likely to get that value from outside of the boundaries of the firm. So we get a consistently positive coefficient across the 4 countries. The pattern that they're more likely to import remains, even if we control for firm size. And the pattern that they are more likely to buy from foreign firms is kept in the case of Costa Rica, Turkey, and Belgium, and not in the case of Uganda. And then you might not remember the signs from the previous slide for columns 4 and 5. We were seeing them as being very big spenders in these economies in terms of how much they purchase per supplier and how many suppliers they have. And once we control for firm size, we realize that once we've taken away the part that is mechanical in their spending behavior, which is the one that has to do with the size of the firm, actually foreign firms are less likely to be big spenders in this economy. They integrate with fewer suppliers and they have smaller purchases per supplier. So there seem to be very consistent differences between FDI firms and domestic firms, even when we account for their differences in size. But again, with the big question, do we really want to control for size, given that size is an important component of their of who they are? Great. Then to finish with this segment of the presentation, here we have the 4-digit sector year fixed effects. So we're not, of course, we're absorbing any difference across foreign firms and domestic firms that are industry specific. And we think that it matters to understand how these patterns differ by industry. So here what we do for the case of Uganda and Costa Rica, we don't have the results yet for Belgium and Turkey, is to show the same variables that we had in the previous tables, again, the means for foreign firms. But now we show these means by R&D intensity or knowledge intensity of the industry of the FDI firm. And let's again focus on the first 3 columns because we're totally out of time and I'm going to get scolded. And what is the takeaway that I want you to have? The takeaway is that the more knowledge intensive an industry is, the more FDI firms will tend to create value added in-house as opposed to gathering it from outside of the boundaries of the firm. So that's column 1. Column 2 is telling us, particularly for the manufacturing industry, that the more high-tech, the more knowledge-intensive a manufacturing industry is, the less it's likely to purchase inputs in the country, and the more likely it is to purchase inputs from other FDI firms. And you might ask yourself, okay, why do we care how these different sourcing behaviors vary by country, but vary by industry? Well, we care because we've learned from a previous work of ours that the benefits of interacting with a multinational buyer depend on which industry that multinational buyer is in. So for instance, here, we're looking at what are the TFP gains for a first-time supplier to a multinational buyer and how they depend on the industry of the first multinational buyer that these firms have. And basically what we see, focus on the last 4 columns, is that most of the gains are coming from interacting with manufacturing industries. And there's a different table that I don't have here, which shows that it's coming from manufacturing industries that are high tech, that are knowledge intensive, and also from high tech knowledge intensive services. So we don't just care about how integrated foreign firms are, but if we think that there are productivity spillovers from interacting with these foreign firms, we care how FDI firms in particular industries with knowledge potential, how they are integrated. It's great if multinationals in agriculture are very integrated, okay, but then they don't generate any knowledge spillovers. And that's a negative to be taken into consideration.
Isabella?
Yes.
We have another question by
Yes.
Daniel Prosi, again from the European University Institute. And he asked, how do you measure R&D intensity?
Yeah, so here we're going to take an off-the-shelf classification of industries that comes from a paper that I have somewhere. Where is it? Okay, by Galindo, Rueda, and Verger. And there's also the Eurostat/OECD classification of industries. So here we're not doing anything ourselves. Here we're just taking off the shelf sector level industries, and we're kind of making this, we're using this R&D intensity or this knowledge intensity as measured by the OECD, Eurostat in this particular paper to say these are industries where it's more likely to have room for knowledge spillovers. But it's not our own classification, just to clarify. Okay, so very quickly, the point of the next 10 slides or so that I think, given time, I will need to fly over is the following. A lot of what we know from how integrated these foreign firms are comes from input-output tables. We typically do not have firm-to-firm linkages data, so we typically do not know at the micro level the behavior of specific firms within an industry. So I don't have time to go through the formulas, but let me just say what is in the histograms. And if there are questions, I'm happy to go through the methodology more precisely. But basically what we have in this in these two histograms is what are the sales that domestic firms are making directly to FDI firms in their economy, as observed directly in the firm-to-firm data. So that's the red histogram, and it's telling us, what is the fraction of domestic firms that falls into each of these log sales bin. And then the black histogram is what would have been, or what are the predicted sales that these same firms are making if we were to only use the input-output table. And even use an input-output table that is very disaggregated sectorally, so at the 4-digit industry. And the takeaway from these histograms is that we are overestimating the amounts that domestic firms are selling to FDI firms. So if we think, okay, we think that any benefit that materializes to domestic firms would be proportional to the sales that these firms are making. And we want some proxy of how much these firms are selling to FDI firms. The takeaway from this histogram is that if we make these predictions based on input-output tables, we would have a histogram that is skewed to the right relative to the actual histogram of sales that these firms are actually making as we observe them from the firm-to-firm data. And the same holds true for the case of Turkey and Belgium. Now assume that instead of, if maybe you think, well, I don't think that the way that benefits materialize in interactions between domestic firms and FDI firms, I don't think that they materialize proportional to how much you sell. but I think they materialize based on a measure of intensity of how much of your overall activity in the domestic firm is dedicated towards serving the foreign buyer. So if that's the view of the world that you have, that you think that what we care about is the intensity of that relationship measured as a share of sales that go towards selling to foreign firms, then this is what we get for the Ugandan and Costa Rican case in red if we actually use the firm-to-firm data, and in black if we use the input-output table. And basically what we're learning from here is that if we actually use the firm-to-firm data, what we would learn is that most firms, most domestic firms in each of these economies are very little touched by foreign firms if the touch is measured as a share. And if we were to use the input-output table, we would get a very distorted understanding of how integrated firms actually are with these foreign firms. And the same holds true for Turkey and Belgium. So it's not something specific to Uganda or Costa Rica. In all of these firms, in all of these countries, using input-output tables is a bad idea. Okay. I'm going to skip this next couple of slides, but basically what we're doing here, we're characterizing which are the firms that we observe as being very integrated with foreign firms, which are the characteristics of domestic firms that we observe as being very integrated with foreign firms, depending on what we think that the right measure of integration is. So let me skip that. Something else that is very, so what we saw before in the histograms is the distribution of domestic firms by their share of sales going to foreign firms. But maybe you say, okay, no, in the world that I live in, I don't care how these opportunities to integrate with multinationals are distributed. I don't think that we should care about having a lot of small, tiny firms being very integrated with multinationals. I think that we need to account for the size of these firms that are dealing with multinationals, that are supplying to multinationals. And we don't have in our objective function that we want to distribute as widely as possible these opportunities across many small firms. So if that's the worldview that you live in, then alternatively, then you would say, well, what I care about is what is the multiplier of these foreign firms. And I don't care how that multiplier, how that indirect economic activity is distributed across firms. We just want to know what is their footprint. So the direct footprint, how many jobs or how many sales they're generating, but also indirectly, what is the spread that they have in the domestic economy. And why do we care about this? There's policy relevance. If you look at most ways in which policymakers estimate the gains from special economic zones, attracting FDI firms, they actually use these employment multipliers as an input in their calculation. And there's also theoretical reasons, such as a paper by Rodriguez-Clare in the AER, showing that you can formalize the source of the production externality in such a way that what you care about is the linkage coefficient of a firm, which is the ratio of employment that it generates in upstream industries relative to the direct employment that it creates. So there are also normative reasons why we care about this employment multiplier. And basically what we're learning from in this slide, so here we have Uganda, Costa Rica, and Turkey. In the fourth and fifth columns, we are learning what is the employment multiplier. So how many indirect jobs are created per direct job created at a foreign firm, depending on whether you use the input-output table as a way to proxy for how many jobs are created versus using the actual firm-to-firm data. So, and in the last column, we're just taking the ratio of the prediction of the multiplier using the input-output table relative to the firm-to-firm data. So we could have just directly used the firm-to-firm data and told you, look, these are the multipliers, this is what we're learning, and you would have said, they're smaller than I would have expected maybe. But I think it's useful to have as a benchmark what this employment multiplier would have been had you used the input-output table, which is typically what is being done. And what is noteworthy is that we're particularly, we're overestimating by a factor of 2 to 5 times, depending on the industry, what this multiplier is. So remember my motivation at the beginning of the slides, I was telling you, if you look at the cost-benefit analysis that policymakers are doing, the indirect effects are really up there in terms of magnitude of their importance. And they're typically calculated using the input-output tables. And what I'm telling you is that there's a vast overestimation of those indirect effects. And what this table is telling you, and let me just focus your attention on this particular column. This is for FDI firms in manufacturing in Uganda. And we're again ranking them by how sophisticated their industry is. And what we're learning is that they tend to have lower and lower employment multipliers the more sophisticated the industry is. So their footprint is smaller the more sophisticated the industry is. And what this column is telling us is that if we are to use the input-output table as a way to estimate how integrated these firms are, we would basically be particularly off if we go to the highest knowledge intensity industries, which are the ones where you would expect to have knowledge spillovers. I'm not leaving a lot of room for discussion, so I think I'm going to skip the model. And let me just sort of tell you what we're trying to do with the model, and I will conclude in a minute. So what we're basically trying to do with the model is to use empirically motivated functional forms for the externality transmission. So we've discussed along the way that we care how integrated foreign firms are to the extent that we think there are distortions in the economy that are related to the foreign ownership of these firms. And given what shape that distortion takes, that will inform what kind of integration patterns we want for these firms. So let me be more specific. If we think that there are production externalities from interacting with foreign firms, and if we think that they are acting as a magic touch, then you would want everyone in the economy, or as many firms in the economy, to interact with these firms irrespective of their size or the size of the transaction. If you think that what matters is the share that they are transacting with multinationals, then maybe you want to concentrate the relationships with these foreign multinationals in only a handful of firms that can have a higher intensity of getting the externality. But then there's also the discussion of, can we allow for the knowledge spillover to also go towards the domestic buyers of those domestic suppliers? So then there's more interesting economics in there, because then maybe you don't want to max out on the share of sales that these firms are doing to foreign firms, because we also want them to sell a bit to domestic buyers and also propagate these knowledge spillovers in the rest of the economy. So basically, to conclude, what we want is, okay, we have these facts that are descriptive, that are positive, and we want to go deeper, understand what is the functional form for the way that these externalities transmit, and then embed that in a model that will have normative implications for the kind of integration patterns that we want to encourage. Sorry for speaking a lot. I hope this was interesting.
Well, thank you very much, Isabella. Let's come to a few questions. Shwan Shavani asks, how are the recent changes in onshoring or friendshoring affect how FDI could impact local firms, that is their contribution, given that the landscape is changing and newer FDI destinations have a longer way to go to provide the level of supply that was available in countries like China?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think what is important to acknowledge is that when a new country is trying to enter, to become an attractive destination for FDI, it needs to clarify what are the objectives that they're trying to meet with attracting those firms. If it's really about hoping to generate, so for instance, if it's an economy with a lot of slack capacity where they're lacking behind in terms of formal jobs, then maybe just attracting these foreign firms that would create formal jobs and then would interact and encourage the formal side of the economy, maybe that's good enough. However, if the economy is not as constrained in terms of having a lot of underused resources, and what it hopes to do is to tap more into the knowledge spillovers potential of those firms, then the question is, are you attracting firms that meet so first we need to think how integrated those multinationals would be in the local economy. And second, how much knowledge spillover potential there is from those FDI firms. So it could be that a country would attract, let's say, multinationals in garment, and then those multinationals in garment maybe would find local suppliers to supply to them, but then maybe there's very little room for knowledge spillovers to occur in those relationships. So I think just having clarity on what are the objectives that they're trying to meet with attracting those firms is really important, and that's one of the main ambitions of this project.
Then I have a question for myself. So I guess it relates to your status fact that FDI firms purchase less from domestic suppliers once accounting for size. And my question is, what do you think about the importance about dynamic effects of FDI on local suppliers? And for some context, we have a supplier development project in Rwanda, and where we look at frictions for domestic suppliers to connect to multinationals in the country and vice versa. And when we talk to firms, we see a lot of learning by doing or by exporting effects, where interaction with multinationals allows firms to learn about things like standards, but also in the face of credit constraints, makes domestic suppliers grow organically while interacting with FDI firms. So how do you see the role of FDI firms in creating a learning environment for domestic firms to increase supply to FDI firms over time, and eventually being able to start exporting and growing?
Yeah, for sure. So the paper that the Alfaro Ureña et al. Paper, the one that we have recently published, is looking into, to the extent that there are opportunities to match with foreign firms. So you become a first-time supplier to a multinational, what happens to firms? And we do show that there are clear, unambiguous benefits on average from becoming a first-time supplier to a multinational. But there are two caveats or two things that I want to emphasize. Yes, there are these average benefits, but these average benefits, as any average, hides a lot of heterogeneity. And as I mentioned before, if the kind of multinationals that are attracted in a country are multinationals in wholesale and retail, in low-tech manufacturing, in administrative services, and security services or low-tech manufacturing, then there's less room for such learning to occur. So there's that. And second, there's the question of how many firms have the opportunity of linking to these firms. Because, in that paper we show, yes, it's a great thing if you manage to match, but how many firms manage to have that opportunity? Like, the whole purpose of this project is to question how widely distributed these opportunities are, and to put some structure into what kind of linkages do we want to encourage. there are limited resources as to how many linkages we can foster, how many roundtables we can organize, how many meetings we can pay for, and so on and so forth. So just having clarity on what are the kind of interactions, what are the characteristics of the supplier, of the buyer, and of the nature of their relationship that is actually going to lead to benefits.
Perfect. And what a perfect question to wrap this seminar up comes from Candice White from the World Economic Forum. And she asked, is there a paper available detailing your findings?
Not yet. We think there will be 2 papers. As you saw, there's a lot of stuff in here. So one paper will be about measurement and will really emphasize how and why we're getting things wrong as we use input-output tables, because we think there's still a lot of over-reliance on input-output tables, and they're particularly not informative when we care about firms that have very special characteristics, such as FDI firms. So there will be one paper about that, and the other paper is the one that will have the general equilibrium framework that I alluded to at the end. But so far, the drafts are not yet available. It's been quite something to put this data set together from the 4 countries. So it has been slower than anticipated. But thank you for the interest.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Manilic. And thank you to all the attendees. So I'd also like to remind you that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation. So please take a minute to fill that out later on, as your feedback is, of course, very important to us. So thank you very much, and have a good weekend.
Thank you so much, everyone.